Hello, welcome to More Than a Muse podcast. I'm Sadie.
Stauney, and happy Monday. If you're new here, this is More Than Muse, where we like to reframe art history and pop culture with feminism and also explore artists that you've never heard of before, as well as ones that you have, but maybe don't know as much about as you should because they didn't show up in the history books enough.
Exactly. Like today, for example, of course I know who this artist is. Of course, I'm familiar with her work, her signature look, but I actually don't know a lot about her story. We've touched on her a little bit in the past because we've done episodes about powerful art couples, the good and the bad. So we've talked about her a little bit, but beyond that, I honestly don't know a lot. So I am excited to learn today.
I honestly didn't know a ton either. I knew bits and pieces, but even though we talked about her in art history, we didn't really talk about her, if that makes sense. She got lumped in with surrealism, which is funny because she's not really a part of that. They consider her like a sister of the surrealists, but she wasn't really a part of that. It was more Mexican folk painting. And so it's interesting reading through this. I was like, I didn't really learn exactly about her, actually. Like, they probably should have talked about her a little bit more.
Especially considered, I feel like she's one of the most known women artists, sure, but also like period. I feel just her name is very familiar in like modern pop culture still.
Definitely.
So.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm trying to remember where I saw it. Might even be in the research later, but it talked about how the fact that people discuss Vincent van Gogh's life and tragedies and everything in this grand way, kind of glamorizing like this starving artist and everything. But his name is always in relation to his paintings. And what happens with Frida Kahlo is because she painted a lot of self-portraits, instead of her work always being said in reference to her art, like her tragedies and her life and everything, instead it's like only looked at in reference to her, which is really interesting because Vincent van Gogh even did a lot of self-portraits, but people think of him more for other things that he did and talk a lot more about that. And she does have a life full of a lot of tragedy, definitely. So gear up for that. And also she liked to create a narrative about herself that wasn't entirely true. So there's a lot of moments where she said this, but that's not actually what it was. It was this. She was creating her own lore and it wasn't accurate, but it like fit the narrative better that she wanted to put out into the world, which is very interesting. She's very fascinating. So I'm excited to talk about her.
I would be curious of how many famous people are doing that currently, or honestly, just people from history, period, are actually just spinning their own narratives and creating their own lore in favor of whatever persona they want to be portrayed, or maybe even in the name of protecting their own private life. I'm sure that's happening a lot. And I feel like especially with the way like the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni thing has gone down, I don't want to touch that, but I do think it's interesting to realize how much is manipulated by headlines and press things that can so easily sway public opinion. So I don't know, I feel like that's very interesting of like how many celebrities are doing that, and actually how much has that been going on this whole time of this lore spinning and all of that.
The minute you said that, I immediately thought of Hilaria Baldwin and how she's like not Spanish, but she's created this whole life and like world in which she is, where she like forgets how to say English words and everyone's, you grew up in Boston or whatever.
That's not real. Yeah. Or even like J-Lo, I feel like that was happening last year where people were calling her out for like the way she was acting in her documentary. And I was like, maybe that's not really what happened. It's just, I don't know what you have happened. It's just your life story. I don't know. I guess we all do that in our own lives, right? We tell stories about ourselves and fit ourselves into narratives. But anyways, that's just,
I guess
funny.
You got to romanticize it a little bit somehow.
Totally.
Yeah.
What's the harm in romanticizing your life?
It just ends up being really confusing to try and talk about later.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm sure the historians will be perplexed, but you gotta do what you gotta do. It is fun though, the amount of artists that will touch on and then have to do the asterisk at the beginning of this is what they said. We don't know if any of this is true. Like Tamara de Lempicka, that's another
Yes.
one where like she created her own lore. We don't know what
Nope.
happened there. So
We can
just funny.
guess, but we have no idea.
We can
But
guess.
yeah, I feel like it
Mm-hmm.
does tell you a lot about who they were as a person, though. That like the different things they
Totally.
choose to like.
Like what they
Yes,
value and what they want the world as. I feel like that's maybe just as telling as the truth, you know?
definitely. Yep. Are we ready to start? Do we need to
Let's talk about
Okay.
her.
So obviously we're talking about Frida Kahlo. And she was actually born Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderon on the 6th of July in 1907 in Coyoacan, which is the village on the outskirts of Mexico City. And she said that
Hmm.
she was born at their family home, La Casa Azul. She was not. She was born a couple of houses down at her maternal grandmother's home. But La Casa Azul is now a very prominent Frida Kahlo location. It's a museum
Mm.
and it is her childhood home, like it was the family home. So I think it added to that where she wanted it to be her birthplace.
Mm-hmm.
Her father was a photographer, Guillermo, and her mother, Matilda, was just a lovely lady. They were 36 and 30 when they had her, so a little bit older in age than I think was typical around that time. Guillermo was originally from Germany and he had immigrated to Mexico in 1891 after epilepsy was caused by an accident that ended his university studies. So he ended up in Mexico, and then Kahlo liked to say that her father was Jewish and her paternal grandparents were Jews from the city of Arad. But later, some German genealogists looked into it and found that he was Lutheran, which I'm like, I guess
Hmm.
technically that's like religion, and maybe there was like heritage Jewish in there instead, because I know you can be like Jewish
Yeah.
genetically and Jewish religiously, but he probably wasn't as Jewish as she said. And then her mother, Matilda, was born in Oaxaca to an indigenous father and a mother of Spanish descent. And Frida also had three sisters that she grew up with: Matilda, named after her mother, Adriana, and Christina. And then she also had two half sisters from Guillermo's first marriage, but they actually were raised in a convent, so they didn't know them very well. Her atmosphere of her childhood home she described as very sad. Both of her parents were very sick. The marriage was devoid of love. Her mother's relationship with her was very tense. She described her mother as kind, active, and intelligent, but also calculating, cruel, and fanatically religious. And her father's photography business was suffering a lot during the Mexican Revolution because an overthrown government had commissioned works from him, which then led to
Mm-hmm.
problems when there's a civil war and you can't find private clients. Not the greatest time to be in the arts. And also, Kahlo just dealt with a lot of sickness throughout her life on a personal level. When she was only 6 years old, she got polio, which made one of her legs grow shorter and thinner than the other side. And so it
Hmm.
also forced her to be isolated from her peers for months, leading to bullying. And while the
Oh.
experience made her reclusive, it also bonded her with her father. And she ended up becoming his favorite child because he also knew what it was like to live with a disability. So they got very close. And she credits him for making her childhood marvelous, saying he was an immense example to me of tenderness, of work. He was a photographer and also a painter, and above all, an understanding for all of my problems. And he took on her education for that short while she was like a recluse away from everyone else, teaching her about literature, nature, and philosophy, encouraging her to play sports in order to try and regain her strength and get muscle back in her leg after polio. And apparently that was also like controversial because physical exercise was unsuitable for girls at the time, but he
Mm-hmm.
pushed that for her to help her recover. And then also taught her about photography, and she began to help him to retouch, develop, and color photographs, which at the time had to all be done in post, I think. So quite an
Yeah, a
endeavor.
lot different.
Yes, of all the retouchments and everything, they didn't have Photoshop, so they're doing it all by hand in a dark room. So, because of the polio, she started school later, and with her younger sister Christina, she attended the local kindergarten and primary school and then was homeschooled for fifth and sixth grades. Christina followed her sisters into a convent school, But Kahlo was enrolled in a German school because her father wanted her to go to a German school instead of the convent school. So a little bit of
Hmm.
favoritism there, where it's like all of her other sisters went to the same school and she went to a different one. However, she was soon expelled for disobedience from the German school. I don't know why. However,
Hmm.
there's some more disobedience later on that, like, maybe that could have been it. So she was sent to a vocational teachers school, and her stay at the school was brief. She actually was sexually abused by a female teacher while she was there, and so she returned home. In 1922, she then was accepted into an elite national preparatory school where they were focusing on natural sciences, and she had the aim of becoming a physician. But the institution had only recently begun admitting women, with only 35 girls out of 2,000 students. So, like, brand new in the integration of that. And she performed well academically, and the school promoted indigenismo, which was this new sense of Mexican identity that took pride in the country's indigenous nature and was trying to get rid of a lot of the colonial mindset of Europe as superior to Mexico. So, really trying to promote the individual culture and the native nature of Mexico. And this was really influential to Kahlo. This follows her throughout the rest of her life.
Yeah.
With 9 of her schoolmates, she formed an infernal group called the Cachakas. And they would end up becoming like these leading figures of Mexican elite. Like, they all ended up becoming very prominent figures. And so that was very fundamental to her. With all of them, they, however, were very troublemakers. They were rebellious, and anything that was conservative, they were against it. They pulled pranks, they staged plays, they debated philosophy and Russian classics. And to mask the fact that she was older, because she had started school a couple of years later, and to declare herself a daughter of the revolution, she began saying that she had been born on the 7th of July, 1910, the year the Mexican Revolution began, which she continued to say throughout her life. So, once again, adding to her
Hmm.
own personal lore,
Hmm.
wanting to be a daughter of the revolution. During this time, she also fell in love with Alejandro Gomez Arias, who was the leader of the group and her first love. Her parents didn't approve of the relationship, and so they were often separated from each other. Also, once again, there's a lot of political instability at the time. There's a lot of violence going on, so it doesn't really make it easy when your parents don't approve and are separating you to continue a relationship.
Mm.
They had a lot of passionate love letters, but weren't really able to continue their relationship much further. Also, throughout her early life, received drawing instruction from a printmaker named Fernando Ferdinand, who was her father's friend, and began filling notebooks with sketches and even working outside of the home to help her family as a stenographer and then a graving apprentice for Fernandez. And she actually didn't consider art as a career. So even though she was working in the arts, like I said earlier, she went to become a physician, but art was like a very important part of her life. Then she got hurt again, and this ended up being very detrimental for the rest of her life. She got hit by a bus.
Wow.
Yeah. On September 17th, 1925, her and her boyfriend, that I talked about, Arias, were on their way home from school. They boarded one bus, but then got off of it to look for an umbrella that she had left behind. They then boarded a second bus, which was crowded, and sat in the back. And when the driver was attempting to pass an oncoming electric streetcar, the streetcar crashed into the side of the wooden bus, dragging it several feet, and the passengers were killed in the accident. A few of them received minor
Wow.
injuries. Some of them got killed, obviously, and she was impaled by an iron handrail that went through her pelvis,
Oh my gosh.
and later described the injury as
Ugh.
the way a sword pierces a bowl. And they were able to remove the handrail. They obviously had to in order to get her off the bus. So her childhood boyfriend and others had to remove this handrail out of her pelvis on the bus in order to get her off. And it fractured her pelvic bone. Her abdomen and uterus had been punctured by the rail. Her spine was broken in 3 places. Her right leg was broken in 11 places. Her right foot was crushed and dislocated. Her collarbone was broken, and her shoulder was dislocated.
Oh my
Yeah, so,
gosh.
like, horrible injuries. Like, honestly, miracle she made it.
That's what I was just gonna say. Like, how, wow, that's
Yeah, she
crazy.
had to spend a month in the hospital and then 2 months at home before she was able to return to work, which honestly sounds way too short to
Wow.
me. I'm like,
That's what I was gonna say. Whoa, that's a lot of things that got
no,
like
I
affected
feel
here.
like
How is she going back to work
I would
already?
be out of commission for 6 months to a year if all of that had happened to me.
Yeah.
So, really horrible. And even though she continued to like return to work, she began to experience fatigue and back pain, and
Mm,
which, I mean, granted. So then the doctors ordered some x-rays to figure out what was causing the back pain because they wanted to make sure everything had gotten back into place. And they revealed that the accident had also displaced 3 of her vertebrae. And so she had to wear this like plaster corset that confined her to her bed for
whoa.
the better part of 3 months so that they could try and get her back in place.
It really is a miracle that, wow,
Yeah.
she lived to tell the tale. That's crazy. I did not know this about her.
Yeah, it's horrific, honestly. But the crazy part is that's what interested her once again in the arts because there wasn't very much she
Hmm.
could do as she's laying in bed. And she knew that she was going to have pain and illness for the rest of her life because of this accident.
Mm,
And so her dreams of becoming a physician were pretty much gone. Like it wasn't going to work out.
yeah.
And then her friend Andres said that she lived dying because she was just
Mm,
laying there, like for months on end. When she was laying in bed, one of the things that her family did for her is made it so that she could paint. So they put a mirror up above
mm,
her bed and then like paints, and so she could look at herself and paint herself. And then she also ended up painting a lot of her family members, and I think this was at this time. If not, then it was another time when she was recovering in bed, but we'll double check that. So her bed rest was over by late 1927, and she began to socialize with her old school friends again. Most of them were at university and all involved in student politics, which you can expect from a lot of politically invested young
mm-hmm.
children. At this time, she joined the Mexican Communist Party, which she's probably one of the most, if not the most prominent member of the Mexican Communist Party
Mm-hmm.
that will come up. She was very involved. And she was introduced to a circle of political activists and artists, including the exiled Cuban communist Giulio Antonio Mella and the Italian American photographer Tina Modotti. And then at one of Tina Modotti's parties in June 1928, she was introduced to Diego Rivera, which is
Mm.
her future husband. They had met briefly in 1922 when he was painting a mural at her school, but then when they were reintroduced in 1928, Kahlo asked him to judge whether or not her paintings showed enough talent for her to pursue a career as an artist. And he was
Wow.
very impressed by her works, saying that they showed an unusual energy of expression, precise delineation of character, and true severity. They had fundamental plastic honesty and an artistic personality of their own. It was obvious to me that this girl was an authentic artist. So
Hmm.
he did speak very highly of her, thought she was very talented, and encouraged her to pursue it. However, he was 21 years older than her and had two common law wives already, which I don't know how that works.
Whoa, I did not know that he was already with wife.
Yeah, two.
Sorry, with wives.
So
Very
I don't
big
really
difference.
know how that worked, but they were married in a civil ceremony on August 21st of 1929. Her mother obviously was opposed to the marriage, and both of
Mm-hmm.
her parents referred to it as a marriage between an elephant and a dove, referring to the differences in size. He was tall and
Wow.
overweight, and she was very petite and fragile. So, yeah, her parents were not thrilled.
Did not approve.
Regardless, her father liked Riviera himself. He was a fan of him, and he was wealthy, able to support Kahlo, who could not work.
And two other
Yeah.
wives.
And she had all these injuries still that, were causing issues.
Mm-hmm.
She couldn't have a regular job and also had to have a lot of expensive medical treatment. So, like, her dad was just happy that he was someone that could, like, afford to pay for all of that and
Yeah.
support her, which I mean, the bare minimum, but
Yeah, of
but
course.
like nice nonetheless. The wedding was reported by the Mexican and international press, and the marriage was subject to constant media attention in Mexico in the following years, with articles referring to the couple as simply as Diego and Frida. I don't know if that was
Hmm.
because of him, because he already had some prominence, Or if slow news day and they were just like, hey, these
Yeah, yeah,
people got
yeah.
married.
I also feel like it was more common for in towns for them to announce things like
That's
that. Like
true.
I am not speaking on a major authority, but I do feel like in old-timey movies or like books you read, like they'll always reference like, "Oh, I saw the marriage in the
Oh,
paper," you know,
yeah.
I for family members or who people who are have any place in society. And I'm sure if he was really wealthy, I guess that makes sense
Yeah.
that they would make note of
They'd be
it.
like, hey, he got married again.
Because I guess it wasn't like breaking
No.
news, like Channel 5, where, you know, they're doing news stories, which even then, those news stories can sometimes be like, we're doing a story on this. So I feel like it's probably just there's obituaries in the newspaper. There's also the marriages.
Yep.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably nice and
That is a
normal.
good point. They did, however, became referred to as just their first names. So they were very well known by the newspapers.
True.
Soon after their marriage, they moved to Cuernavaca in the rural state of Morelos, which, by the way, I'm also probably saying a lot of these wrong. I'm trying my best. But Diego had been commissioned to paint murals for the Palace of Cortez. And around the same time, Frida Kahlo had resigned her membership of the PCM in support of Rivera, which is the Mexican Communist Party, to support
Mm-hmm.
him, who had been expelled shortly before the marriage for his support of the leftist opposition movement within the Third International. I know nothing about politics, so I don't know what this means. But he got kicked out of the Mexican Communist Party, so she resigned. She does end up being a part of it anyway.
Okay.
But I don't know if that was just like activity wise or not. During the Civil War, Morelos, which was the state they were living in, had seen some of the heaviest fighting, and life in the Spanish style city of Cuernavaca sharpened Kahlo's sense of Mexican identity and history. Similar to many other Mexican women artists and intellectuals at the time, she began wearing traditional indigenous Mexican peasant clothing to emphasize her ancestry, long and colorful skirts, elaborate headdresses, masses of jewelry. She especially favored the dress of women from the matriarchal society, or I guess like allegedly matriarchal society, the Isthmus of Tucanpec, who had come to represent an authentic and indigenous Mexican cultural heritage in post revolutionary Mexico. The outfit allowed Kahlo to express her feminist and anti colonialist ideals, and that only gets stronger and stronger. Most of the paintings that she made during this time were portraits of herself, her sisters, and her school friends. Her early paintings and correspondence show that she had a lot of influence from European artists in her early art. You'd think of Renaissance masters like Botticelli, Bronzino, or avant-garde movements like Cubism. But after moving to Morelos with Rivera, she was really inspired by the city that they lived in and changed her artistic style to draw more inspiration from Mexican folk art. And that continued throughout the rest of her life. She probably was influenced by Adolfo Bestmargard's treatise on the subject, because a lot of characteristics that he outlined, like lack of perspective, combining of elements from pre-Columbian and colonial periods of Mexican art, was all found within her work. And her identification with La Raza, the people of Mexico, and her profound interest in its culture remained important facets of her art throughout the rest of her life. So
Wow.
it just continues on. And the lack of perspective is something that's like very akin to folk art, where the characters just exist in the space almost like little cutouts. They don't have like long hallways and stuff. So that is like a very important part of her work. Then Riviera completed his commission in Cuernavaca in the late 1930s, and so they moved to San Francisco for a while. And he was
Nice.
painting murals for the Luncheon Club of the San Francisco Stock Exchange and the California School of Fine Arts. And they were feted, lionized, and spoiled by influential collectors and clients during their stay in the city. So they were living very nice while people were trying to suck up to him to get some of his art. When Kahlo and Riviera moved to San Francisco, she was introduced to a lot of American artists. And then the 6 months spent in San Francisco were very productive for her. She further developed her folk art style she had adopted. In addition to painting portraits of new acquaintances, she also made Frida and Diego Rivera, which was a double portrait based on their wedding photograph and is very famous, and the portrait of Luther Burbank, which depicted a horticulturist as a hybrid between a human and a plant, which is fun because what other way would you want to describe a horticulturist than as a hybrid between a human and a plant? And then although she publicly presented herself simply as Rivera's spouse rather than an artist, she was able to participate in an exhibition for the first time when her painting Frida and Diego Rivera was included in the San Francisco Society of Women Artists in the Palace of the Legion of Honor. And she also started an affair during this time with a Hungarian-American photographer, Nicholas Murray.
Wow.
And it won't be the last one in their marriage. Like I said, very tumultuous.
He started with 2
I know.
wives.
How do you
It's fine.
how do you walk into that being like, I'll remain faithful to you? And I have 2 common law wives somewhere that
I don't know the technicalities of those arrangements.
But he had already been married twice and still was, according to the record.
That's funny.
They returned to Mexico in 1931 and then also traveled to New York City in the fall for the opening of Rivera's retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. If you're not aware at this time, if you can't tell, Diego Rivera was a very prominent artist at this time. Yeah. It's hilarious now because Frida Kahlo's name far outshines him in so many ways. Yeah. But like, he had exhibitions. People really wanted his artwork. Like, he was very prominent. They headed to Detroit once again so he could paint some murals for the Detroit Institute of Arts. And during this time, Kahlo had some health problems related to a failed pregnancy. If you'll remember when I talked about the bus accident, she had the bar go through her uterus and her pelvis. And apparently it caused this syndrome that I can't remember the name of, but it basically, the scar tissue in her uterus developed to a certain point where there wasn't enough room within it. Ooh, and so pregnancies like just weren't really something that was possible for her. She will continue to have failed pregnancies just because of that throughout the rest of her life. Like, it definitely was like a big problem because her body wasn't capable of it anymore. During these health problems, as well as her dislike for capitalist culture of the United States, welcome to America, Kahlo's time
and great point
in the city was beneficial. She experimented with different techniques like etching, frescoes. Her paintings began to show a stronger narrative style. She began placing emphasis on themes of like terror, suffering, wounds, and pain, which is definitely shown in her work. There's a lot of horror in some of her works. And despite the popularity of the mural in Mexican art at the time, she was making votive images on small metal sheets instead. So not really doing murals as much. And quite a few prominent works came out during this time. I'm not going to name every painting she paints throughout all of this, but just know she's painting a lot. Yeah. By this time, she also became bolder in her interactions with the press, impressing journalists with her fluency in English, stating on her arrival to the city that she was the greater artist of the 2 of them, even being quoted. Of course, Rivera does well for a little boy, but it is I who am the big artist. I know. And I mean, it came true, but at this time, like, people probably thought she was nuts. She told the Detroit News in an interview that even though she enjoyed visiting San Francisco and New York City, she disliked American society, which she regarded as colonialist, and found most Americans boring.
Don't really know. I don't really have an argument for that one.
We probably are. Yeah. She also disliked having to socialize with a lot of the big names of capitalists of the time. You've got Henry Ford, and was angered that many of the hotels in Detroit refused to accept Jewish guests, which I don't think people realize how much anti-Semitism was in early United States. A lot. Yeah. In a letter to a friend, she wrote that, although I'm very interested in all the industrial and mechanical development of the United States, she felt a bit of rage against all of the rich guys here, since I have seen thousands of people in the most terrible misery without anything to eat and with no place to sleep. That is what has most impressed me here. It is terrifying to see the rich having parties day and night while thousands and thousands of people are dying from hunger. Which, can I
Mm-hmm.
just say, yes, again, repeat
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And here we
Yeah.
are, however many years
It's
later.
not fun to watch billionaires do whatever they want while you're struggling. Kahlo's time in Detroit was also complicated by a pregnancy. Her doctor had to perform an abortion, but the medication used was ineffective, so it had caused some problems. She was very ambivalent about having a child and had already undergone an abortion earlier in her marriage. Following the failed abortion, she continued to continue with the pregnancy, but miscarried in July. There's a lot of like heat that I think she gets because she like didn't want to have a child, and so she had these two abortions. But at the same time, like her body really wasn't capable of carrying a child. And I think maybe part of her
Yeah.
knew that like when she was struck in the pelvis and uterus, that like it probably wasn't going to be possible for her. So there is like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ambivalence about motherhood for her that kind of shows up in a lot of her work and stuff. But I can't imagine being in her place. And even if you don't quite fully know what's going on with your body, knowing that something's not
Yeah.
right. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Because obviously, like, her body just couldn't do it. And the miscarriage caused a serious hemorrhage that required her being hospitalized
Ugh.
for 2 weeks. So it's like this woman should just not have been having children. I don't know what the state of birth control was at the time, but
And also too, like, of course you're gonna have a negative outlook on it when every time you try or every time you get pregnant, your body like is hemorrhaging and like having
yes.
such negative reactions to it. Like, of course you're gonna be like, nope, we're not
Yeah,
doing this. This is bad for me, or like, whatever. Yeah, that's crazy that she's
I
flagged for that when
know.
it's like, even if she
No,
wanted
like
to, she did. We
literally
don't
so
know.
bad. And like it could have been a dream when she was younger, but then you get in this huge accident and you're okay,
Mm-hmm.
like this might not be possible. I think that's covered
Yeah.
like crossed every single woman's mind at a certain point. If something happens, how would I cope with the idea of not being able to have children? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
so to have to confront that and deal with that, and then also, yeah, just have all of these things happening over and over again, it would not make you feel very enthusiastic about bringing a child
No.
into the world because yeah, it just caused a lot of problems for her. Hospitalized for 2 weeks. And then less than 3 months later, her mother actually died from complications of surgery in Mexico. But one other note I wanted to make during here is that while none of her works were featured in exhibitions in Detroit, she did give an interview to the Detroit News on her art. And we actually talked about this article in our former episode where the
Mm-hmm.
article was titled Wife of the Master Mural Painter Gleefully Dabbles in Works of Art, which,
Oh, to gleefully dabble.
because it's just, no, she was a very serious artist. But
Mm-hmm.
it shows how they looked at her at the time. Like her famous husband is doing all this accomplished work, and then they're looking at her like, okay, you do some quirky, colorful artwork that they didn't fully
Mm-hmm.
understand either because it's Mexican folk art. And so they just didn't view her as prominent of an artist as she became. Riviera did continue to champion her, though. He called her the first woman in the history of art who has torn open her chest and heart to show the biological truth of her feelings, which I do love that quote. And I think it's very true that she did paint a lot of like raw emotions on canvas in a way that I don't think
Mm-hmm.
many other people were doing at the time. In March, they went to New York City to paint a mural for the Rockefeller Center. But then in May, Riviera was fired from the Rockefeller Center project and instead was hired to paint a mural for the New Workers School. And then, even though he wished to stay in the United States, Kahlo was homesick. Obviously, her mother had just passed away. And so they returned to Mexico after the mural was unveiled. So they returned to Mexico City, and she wasn't really making any paintings at the time and only did two in the following year due to all of her health complications. They moved into a house in a wealthy neighborhood, and it consisted of two sections joined by a bridge. Kahlo had hers painted blue, and Riviera's was pink and white. So they had two different sections of the house joined together by a bridge. And this became like a very important meeting place for artists, political activists, and for Mexico and abroad. She also had some very severe health problems. She had an appendectomy, which I'm like, goodness gracious, give this
Mm,
woman a break.
mhm.
And then
Yeah.
2 more abortions, and then an amputations of gangrenous toes.
Oh.
So just more and more going on that is just hard to deal with. And then her marriage was also
Mhm.
becoming really strained. He wasn't happy to be back in Mexico, and he blamed her for their return.
Mm.
And even though he had been unfaithful to her before, he now embarked on an affair with her younger sister, Christina, which
Yes, I remember this. Yep.
is, it hurt her obviously a lot more than any other affair could do, because
Yeah.
that's her sister. Like, and so after discovering the affair, she moved into an apartment in central Mexico City and did consider divorcing him for a while. She had an affair of her own with an American artist, and then later was reconciled with Rivera and Christina and moved back to their home and became a loving aunt to Christina's children, Asalda and Antonio, which I think
Wow.
were Riviera's kids with Christina.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. And even though they had reconciled, both of them continued infidelities throughout pretty much the rest of their lives. They had a very,
Well, at least they're in
yeah, they had a
agreement.
very interesting marriage. She also resumed her political activities during this time. I think her loyalty to him had waned, and she was like, okay, I'm going to
Yeah.
go get involved in this again. She joined the Fourth International, became a founding member of the Solidarity Committee to provide aid to the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. And then also, her and Rivera successfully petitioned the Mexican government to grant asylum to the former Soviet leader Leon Trotsky and offered La
Hmm.
Casa Azul, her childhood home, for him and his wife as a residence. And they lived there for
Wow.
quite a few months, with Kahlo and Trotsky not only becoming good friends, but also having a brief affair, which I don't know how his wife felt about that, but
Add him to the roster.
yeah. And she even painted a self portrait that was dedicated to him. Yeah,
Wow.
where she's holding a letter to him in the painting of herself. So that's
Hmm.
one to look up if you're interested. So in 1937 and 1938, her artistic career was extremely productive. She painted more than she had done in all of her 8 previous years of marriage. And although she was still unsure about her work, the National Autonomous University of Mexico exhibited some of her paintings, and she made her first significant sale in the summer of 1938 when film star and art collector Edward Robinson purchased 4 paintings at $200 each. 4 Frida Kahlo paintings for $200
Yeah,
each.
for $200
That guy is
each.
sitting
Yeah, right.
pretty with whatever he made on
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
because
yeah.
holy crap. Another, like, even greater recognition followed when a surrealist Andre Breton visited Riviera and was very impressed by Kahlo's work, claiming her as a surrealist and describing her work as a ribbon around a bomb, which is a lovely description.
Yeah. I would like to be called a ribbon around a bomb,
Same,
I think.
yeah. He
Mm-hmm.
not only promised to arrange for her paintings to be exhibited in Paris, but also wrote to his friend and art dealer Julian Levy, who invited her to hold her first solo exhibition at his gallery in Manhattan. And
Hmm.
so in October, she traveled alone to New York, where her colorful Mexican dress caused a sensation and made her seen as the height of exotica, which, rolling my eyes. Come on, people. The exhibition opening in November was attended by famous figures like Georgia O'Keeffe, Claire Booth Lucy, or Luque, and received much positive attention in the press. A lot of the press, however, had a condescending tone that continued because they're the worst.
Mm.
Time wrote
Always.
that little Frida's pictures had the daintiness of miniatures, the vivid reds and yellows of the Mexican tradition, and the playfully bloody fancy of an unsentimental child.
That is the rudest thing I've ever heard.
Time magazine, come on.
If someone said that about my art, oh, like that, I would be like, that's
It's
wow. I
so
can't believe
awful.
that. That is a
However, it was a success. Even though the Great Depression was going on, she sold
right.
half of the 25 paintings presented in the exhibition and went on to receive
Oh,
commissions
okay.
from Goodyear, the president of the MoMA, which I'm assuming was also
Hmm.
the founder of Goodyear, the company, and
Yeah, I wonder what's the connection.
Claire Booth Lucy Luque. I don't know how to say her name, guys. I'm sorry. She wasn't one I learned about. Luce, for whom she painted a portrait of her friend, Dorothy Hale, who had committed suicide by jumping from her apartment building. So I guess fitting for Frida to paint her because she did paint a lot of horrifying things in very pretty ways. She spent 3 months in New York, but painted very little, enjoying the city to the extent that her fragile health allowed and continuing to have ongoing affairs. And then after opening an exhibition in Paris, she sailed back to New York City, was very eager to reunite with one of her affair partners, but he ended the affair because he had met a woman he was planning to marry. And so she
Rude.
traveled back to Mexico City, and Diego Rivera requested a divorce from her at the time. The
Mm.
exact reasons are unknown, but he stated publicly that it was merely a matter of legal convenience in the style of modern times. There are no sentimental,
Hmm.
artistic, or economic reasons. Who knows? I mean,
It seems like at this point they were living pretty
yeah. I'm
independently,
like, but he'd already
doing
been
things on their
married
own.
twice before and still was. So I think maybe he
Hmm.
was like, modern times, I should only have
Yeah.
one wife. I don't I don't know.
Or maybe it's like people get divorced now,
Yeah,
so let's get
that's true
divorced.
too. So she granted him the divorce in November, but they remained friendly, and he actually had her continue to manage his finances and correspondence for him. So they
Hmm.
just continued to live their lives how they were, just no longer married. Oh, in January, she sailed to Paris to follow up on Breton's invitation for an exhibition of her work. When she arrived, she found that he had not cleared her paintings from customs, no longer even owned a gallery, and basically had set her up for disaster. However,
Oh.
with the aid of Marcel Duchamp, which is a very prominent artist, she was able to arrange
Mm-hmm.
for an exhibition at a gallery. However, the gallery refused to show all but two of her paintings because they were considered too shocking for audiences.
Wow. Impressive,
Yep.
honestly.
And then Breton, who had not set up the exhibition but had been the reason that she went to Paris, insisted that these two paintings be shown alongside photographs by Manuel Bravo, pre Columbian sculptures, 18th and 19th century Mexican portraits, and what he considered junk, which was sugar skulls, toys, and other items he had bought from Mexican markets. So, like, sensationalizing the whole, like, thing and, like, her
Mm-hmm.
heritage and turning it into this, like, spectacle, honestly. The exhibition opened in March but didn't get that much attention, nothing compared to what she had gotten in the United States. This was partially due to the Second World War that was ready to happen at any moment, but this was enough of a financial loss that she canceled a planned exhibition in London. However, the Louvre purchased her painting, The Frame, which made her the first Mexican artist to be featured in their collection ever.
Wow. That's so
Yes, which
cool.
is really amazing. So, very cool that happened. She also was greeted warmly by other Parisian artists and got along very well with them. We have Pablo Picasso, John Miro, Elsa Schiaparelli created a dress inspired by her. We have an episode on Elsa Schiaparelli,
Mm-hmm.
and Vogue Paris featured her on its pages. So, Paris embraced her,
Yeah.
just not the art world of Paris. Her overall opinion of Paris and the Surrealists remained pretty negative. In a letter to Murray, she called them this bunch of cuckoo lunatics and very stupid surrealists who are all so crazy, intellectual, and rotten that I can't even stand them anymore.
Incredible.
So
Absolutely.
that's why it's funny that she's considered like a surrealist,
Because you didn't
but
like
she
them.
didn't. She really didn't like them that much. So it's hilarious how much she's associated with it. She moved back to La Casa Azul at this time and was determined to earn her own living, completely separate from Diego Rivera now and be able to live independently. And so, encouraged by the recognition she was receiving, she started using these tin sheets that she had once used to then moving them to large canvases instead and painting bigger paintings, ones that were easier to exhibit and show. She also adopted a more sophisticated technique, limited graphic details, and began to produce more quarter length portraits, which were easier to sell. And she painted several of her most famous paintings at this time. 3 exhibitions featured her works in 1940, and that was in Mexico City, San Francisco, and in New York City as well. And then her friend, remember we talked about her and Diego had gotten asylum for Leon Trotsky that she had a brief affair with.
Mm-hmm.
He ended up being assassinated in her hometown where he had continued to live after leaving La Casa Azul. And the assassination was carried out at his home by a Spanish-born Soviet agent who had infiltrated his inner circle and attacked him with an ice axe. And
Oh my
he died the
gosh.
following day from his injuries. And weirdly enough, Frida and her sister, Christina, were arrested and interrogated by the Mexican authorities after this because she had been close to him. He had been living in her house before she had moved back in. They had their brief romantic affair. And then also, she was a member of the Mexican Communist Party and had personal ties to him. And they arrested her and Christina for 2 days and then eventually released them because there was no substantial evidence that linked them to the crime. I don't know why they would assume that if they were friends, she was involved in the
Yeah.
assassination, but
I guess it's like if you knew anything, maybe you were a spy playing the long
who
game.
knows? But anyway, it shifted quickly to who actually committed the problem and the assassination, and then they were able to be freed. Okay, so then the following month, more medical problems. She traveled to San Francisco and had to have medical treatment on her back and a fungal infection in her hand. She also had continuously fragile health and was increasingly declining since her divorce. It was exacerbated by a very heavy consumption of alcohol. Rivera at the time was in San Francisco because he had fled Mexico City after Trotsky had been murdered and accepted a commission in California. And even though Kahlo had a relationship with an art dealer at the time, she and Rivera reconciled and actually remarried in December in
Wow.
just a simple civil ceremony. Their second union was less tumultuous and more independent than before, so I don't know why they remarried, but they did. While La Casa Azul remained their primary residence, Riviera retained the San Angel house for use as his studio and apartment, and they both continued to have extramarital affairs. Kahlo would go on to have relationships with both men and women, with evidence suggesting her male lovers were more significant to her than her female ones, but I don't know how you could prove that. So who
True.
knows?
Yeah, who knows?
Despite her health getting worse and worse, her reputation was continuing to grow and gaining more and more interest. So she was able to participate in more exhibitions. She, at this time, also became a founding member of a group of 25 artists commissioned by the Ministry of Public Education to spread public knowledge on Mexican culture. So they would plan exhibitions, attend conferences on art, and would be featured in exhibitions on Mexican art staged at the Benjamin Franklin Library. She also participated in the Salon de la Flor, which was this annual flower exposition, and an article by Riviera on Kahlo's art was actually published in the Seminario de Cultural Mexicana at the time too, so he wrote about her art for her. And then she accepted a teaching position and encouraged her students to treat her in an informal and non-hierarchical way, taught them to appreciate Mexican popular culture and folk art, to derive their subjects from the street. And while her health problems made it difficult to commute to the school, she began holding lessons at her house. And four of her students, Fanny Rebel, Arturo Bustos, Guillermo Monroy, and Arturo Estrada, became her devoted followers known as Los Fritos. And she secured 3 mural commissions for herself and her students during this time. One of the things about her is she refused to adapt her style to suit her clients' expectations. So when she would get commissions, she wouldn't do them how they wanted them to do it. She would do them how she wanted to. She got 2 commissions from the Mexican government. One she didn't complete because she didn't like the subject, and another she was rejected by the commissioning body, probably because it didn't turn out how they expected it to. But she did continue to have a lot of private clients that did appreciate her work. And there was even an engineer who ordered more than 30 portraits of family members over a decade from her, which
Wow.
also amazing. Can you imagine having your entire family painted by Frida Kahlo and you have that in your
Frida
collection?
Kahlo. Yeah. That's so cool.
Her financial situation also just continued to improve with a 5,000 peso national prize for her painting. And then when her other painting, Two Fridas, was purchased by the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico, so not the MoMA, but the Mexican Museum of Modern Art, was featured in the majority of group exhibitions in Mexico. And fellow artists at the time wrote that she could sell whatever she was currently painting. Sometimes incomplete pictures were purchased right off of the easel. So she's only gaining traction, only getting more and more popular. And her health problems are just getting worse and worse. Despite her spinal problems, she had to wear 28 different supportive corsets, from steel to leather to plaster, to try and get her back to cooperate. She would have pain in her legs, a chronic infection in her hand. She was treated for syphilis. The death of her father ended up sending her into a deep depression, and her worsening condition ended up confining her almost completely to her house, which became the center of her world. She tended to the house and the garden and invited over friends, servants, and pets. She had parrots, spider monkeys, and little dogs that would often appear in her paintings with her. But by the mid 1940s, her back had deteriorated to the point that she could no longer sit or stand for long periods of time.
That's so
So
sad.
she went to New York. They tried to do a spinal operation where they tried to straighten her spine using a bone graft and a steel support, but it was completely unsuccessful. And even a biographer noted that she did sabotage her own recovery, though, by failing to rest, and in a fit of anger may
Mm,
have even reopened her wounds. So she wasn't handling it very well, which I mean would be
fair.
very hard to. A lot of her paintings at this time were extremely painful and helpless and showed that. So in her final years, she spent most of her time at the hospital in Mexico City, where she underwent a new bone graft surgery on her spine. It caused a difficult infection and necessitated several follow up surgeries. And so, after being discharged, she had to use a wheelchair and crutches in order to move around. And during this last few years of her life, she dedicated most of her time to political causes to the extent that her health had allowed, including campaigning for peace, collecting signatures for the Stockholm Appeal, and continuing to gain recognition in Mexico. She wrote about her political convictions, saying, I have a great restlessness about my paintings, mainly because I want to make it useful to the revolutionary communist movement. Until now, I've managed simply an honest expression of my own self. I must struggle with all my strength to ensure that the little positive of my health allows me to do also benefits the revolution, the only reason to live. Her painting style also changed a lot during this time. It was hastier, more brash, more intense and feverish. And her first solo exhibition took place at the very end of her life. Her friend, a photographer, Lola Alvarez Bravo, understood that she didn't have long to live. And so, even though Kahlo wasn't able to attend the opening initially because her doctors had prescribed her bed rest, she took it upon herself to order that her four-poster bed be moved from her home to the gallery. And so, to the
Good.
surprise of her guests, she arrived in an ambulance, was carried on a stretcher to the bed, and stayed the duration of the party, wearing one of her signature embroidered outfits. She held court from her bed, surrounded by her friends, fellow artists, musicians, critics, and admirers, drank tequila, sang, laughed, and celebrated, creating a surreal scene that blurred the lines between performance, protest, and personal triumph. And yeah, she attended her own
That's cool.
exhibition from her four-poster bed. She was hospitalized again. Her leg was amputated. And then at this time, with her
Oh,
depression and anxiety, she became dependent on painkillers. Rivera started another affair, and she attempted to end her own life by overdose. She was dealing with a lot. Her diary at the time said, they amputated my leg 6 months ago. They have given me centuries of torture, and at moments I almost lost my reason. I keep on wanting to kill myself. Diego is what keeps me from it, though my vain idea that he would miss me. But never in my life have I suffered
oh,
more. I will wait a while.
wow. That's so sad.
Yes. Her last public appearance was only 11 days before her death, when she went to attend a political demonstration in Mexico City protesting the CIA backed coup in Guatemala. The United States, through the CIA, had orchestrated the overthrow of the Guatemalan president and a leftist reformer. And so it was just becoming, it was a huge thing. Like, we're not going to get into all the politics. But anyway, it was widely condemned by leftists and communists around the world, including Frida and Diego. And even though she was gravely ill, bedridden, she had bronchitis and pneumonia, and was
Wow.
still dealing with the pain from her leg amputation, she insisted on attending the protest. They begged her not to go, her friends and family, fearing for her health, but she was determined. She was brought to the march in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets with a large communist flag draped over her, was accompanied by Diego, and greeted warmly by fellow protesters. Many of whom knew her as a lifelong devoted communist and activist. In her last days, she also wrote, "I joyfully await the exit and I hope never to return." And the demonstration, of course, made her more sick, and she had a high fever, was in extreme pain. And then on July 13th, 1954, her nurse found her dead in her bed at only 47 years old.
Uh,
The official cause of death was a pulmonary embolism, although no autopsy was informed. But a lot of people have argued that maybe she overdosed on painkillers. But her health was so bad that, like, she probably didn't have
yeah.
that long left anyway. She had been prescribed the maximum dose of 7 pills, but had taken 11. So it was just a lot. And apparently, she had also given Rivera a wedding anniversary present that evening, which was a month in advance. So there were some signs that she knew she didn't have
Mm.
that long left. On the evening of July 13th, her body was taken, where it lay in a state under a communist flag. And the following day, it was carried to the Pantheon, where friends and family attended an informal funeral ceremony. Hundreds of admirers stood outside, and in accordance with her wishes, she was cremated in a spectacular fashion that had the mourners witness her hair catching fire, her corpse sitting up, and her face forming one last seductive grin. Because if you don't know, when your body starts on fire, you sit up because everything tightens. So she wanted that to be viewed.
Oh.
Diego Rivera stated that her death was the most tragic day of his life, and he ended up dying only 3 years later. And her
Mm.
ashes are actually displayed in a pre Columbian urn at La Casa Azul, which, as I mentioned, has been a museum since 1958.
Wow.
And to end out, I know this is a long one, you guys. I'm sorry. There's a lot about her, but her fame only grew dramatically after her death, and it was spurred primarily by the feminist movement and the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement, if you're not aware, was a civil rights movement in the United States that emerged in the 60s and 70s, led by Mexican Americans fighting for social, political, and cultural empowerment and demanding better education, labor rights, land reform, and an end to discrimination. It included leaders like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in labor organizing, as well as student activists, artists, and intellectuals. And obviously, like, Frida Kahlo probably would have been on board with
Mm-hmm.
everything that was happening within the Chicano movement. And so they helped to revive and elevate her work, especially in the United States, celebrating her as a symbol of cultural pride, resistance, and identity. And it's a movement that they weren't only fighting for equality, but for cultural reclamation. So, like, reclaiming the idea of being a Mexican American and how it wasn't something to erase, it was something to celebrate. And then
Mm-hmm.
retrospectives of her work appeared in 1978 and 1983 by a biography helped cement her legacy, making her the first Latin American artist to break the 1 million auction record in 1990. And subsequent sales
Wow.
have touched millions. And then her face and art became cultural icons, sparking the term Freedom Mania. Her life, her work, her appearance has inspired films, fashion collections, pop culture appearances. There was a biopic, Frida, starring Salma Hayek. She had a cameo in Pixar's Coco, if you've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the 21st century, she was no longer just an artist, but a global symbol of resilience, rebellion, and identity. So that is Frida Kahlo.
Yeah, it's really crazy how much she really is just a cultural icon now with her look and everything. Like, I'm more familiar with who she is than her actual story or even with her art, and I that doesn't happen a lot with the women that we cover. It's like, oh, you happen to know their art and then, oh wow, that happened to a woman. But her, it's no, she's front and center of the whole
So
thing.
much. And it's crazy because it's like Guys, I could just keep going. Like we would be here forever.
Yeah.
Because yeah, like I focused a lot on her personal life because it was something that like I didn't get told about. And like you said, like her appearance and her image is everywhere and but not so much like her story and who she was as a person.
Yeah.
So yeah, like this is definitely just the beginning. You could teach an entire art class on
Mhm.
Frida Kahlo, I feel, and go into like the
Totally.
meaning behind all of her works and like the influence that she's had on pop culture and society after her death and
Totally.
everything else that comes with it. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Everything else. Yeah, thank you for finally teaching me about her. Like I said at the beginning, I really didn't know anything about her except for her iconic, just who she is.
Yeah, me too. I was excited to finally cover her and just the figure that she was, even though controversial at times,
Hmm.
but a very
Yeah.
fascinating woman for sure.
I feel like that's the makings of a true artist. And I think that's something that's interesting to see now with the people who are breaking. And I mean, my first thought is Chapel Roan, where it's like she's not always presenting herself in maybe the best way, or people are
Mm,
upset at the things that she says. And it's artists are supposed to be controversial, in my opinion. Like, if they're a real true artist, they're not going to be liked by a lot of people. You know, they're
yeah.
not going to be a watered down, easy to, like, I don't know, what's the word? Like, placate themselves for everyone, water themselves down, because if they did, they wouldn't be artists at the level that they are. And so it's really interesting to me when people critique artists for being controversial, when it's like, then they wouldn't, they wouldn't
Yeah.
be able to do what
No,
they're
that's
doing, because that's often the character traits that make you want to make art,
no, it's such a good point because it's if they're not being controversial, then what are you talking about?
What's the point?
Yeah, is you're not talking about them, you're not talking about their art. If everyone was just nice and did exactly what they were supposed to, it wouldn't cause the uproar that it does. And I think that's such an
Totally.
important thing to look at. And also just to realize we're all human. We have
Hmm.
opinions and things that don't agree with the mass public, and people are going to make mistakes or like just choices that people don't agree with. And that's part of what being a person is and a public figure, especially. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just you can't please everybody.
True. And I honestly do feel like there's an aspect of choosing to strive and create art, and especially make art be the main way you're, one, providing for yourself, but like choosing to have that be like the main thing in your career is such an act of rebellion and is so like inherently political. I had a friend of mine who shared on their Instagram story that like they were maybe a little bit upset because, or they felt guilty because they weren't able to go to like the protests that were happening
Mm-hmm.
this last weekend, because their band was on tour, and like they just wouldn't be able to make it work, and they felt really guilty about that. But we had a conversation about it where I was like, no, I feel like you're choosing to, you are out there, one, doing it completely independently. You're not supported by a major corporation. Like, you have your ideals and your beliefs, and you are going now and creating these spaces, and you're showing up for your own art and like making these like pockets of joy.
Yeah.
And I think that like in times of unrest, it's a really important thing to hold on to. And like I said, choosing to show up and make art every single day, especially like the world isn't set up to support artists. So
Yeah.
I think that in and of itself is like a political
I agree.
stance, if that makes
Yeah, no,
sense.
I think of even that quote I shared at the end with Frida Kahlo talking about how she wished her art had done more for the communist movement. She's, I feel like I've been able
Mm-hmm.
to express
Yeah.
myself, but like maybe not my political activation as well. And it's, but through all of her expression that she did, it became this huge
Mm-hmm.
symbol of the Chicano movement and
Yeah.
everything moving forward, the Mexican American identity. And so it's like, it ended up doing exactly what she wanted it to, just maybe not in the way that she expected it to at the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Like I said, the world isn't set up for controversial artists, but the world needs them.
They do.
So,
Yeah. Nope. And it's
hmm,
important that they remain there and keep conversations going, even if we don't always agree with everything that they're
absolutely.
doing. Yeah.
I think that's the point.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
definitely.
Again, thank you for bringing her more into my life than she already was. And thanks everyone for listening. I'm glad we finally got to cover Frida
Me
Kahlo.
too. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, all of the things. We have merch available on our
Hmm.
website. Go check it out. And we will be back next Monday with another podcast.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.